Pleasure to speak with you about the next decade of what I see as tremendous opportunity for healthcare transformation. Our clinical effectiveness business at Wolters Kluwer has a mission to improve the quality and reduce the cost of healthcare globally with a suite of solutions that provide technology-enabled decision support across care teams, including physicians, pharmacists, nurses, and patients. Although we've been doing this for almost 30 years, the last year and a half brought unique challenges as we were relied on to help clinicians provide the best patient care during the pandemic. But despite the challenges, that view from the front lines gave us a unique perspective into how healthcare may change moving forward, and I'd like to share that perspective with you today. I'll begin by saying that while the pandemic has forced us to rethink what healthcare will look like in the coming years, most of the trends I'll share with you today aren't new. I believe the New York Times said it best with the headline that the pandemic isn't changing everything, but it is speeding up trends that were already underway. 4 of those key areas of change that I'll highlight for the rest of this discussion include, starting at the top left, decision support guidance and workflow, leveraging data, AI, and other advanced technologies, a scalable blend of virtual and in-person care, and more personalized and contextualized experiences. Let's begin by talking about decision support and workflow. First, a test. What's the difference between these 2 pictures? It isn't a trick, they're mirror images, but otherwise they're the exact same people. These pictures represent 2 well-matched populations of people in 2 cities in the United States. New Haven, Connecticut on the left, which is home to Yale University, and Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm speaking to you from right now, which is home to Harvard, among other prominent universities. When I say these are well matched, I mean that demographically, including age, gender, fitness, health problems, etc., these populations are very similar. Now, why is that important? Because if these populations are so similar, why is it that people from New Haven are twice as likely to have bypass surgery than people from Boston, while people from Boston are twice as likely to have carotid artery surgery as people from New Haven? We don't necessarily know which scenario is right, but that isn't the point. The point is that for no reason other than where you live, you may get very different healthcare. Maybe you're asking yourself if this is a big deal. Does it really matter? And the answer is yes, it most certainly does matter because of data like these. This was a landmark study published in the New England Journal of Medicine that found that patients only receive about half of the recommended processes of care, both from overuse of resources and from underuse of resources. Another name for this phenomenon of patients receiving different care based on where they live or which doctor they see is unwanted variability in care. We call it unwanted because it's a major problem in healthcare. It's a significant contributor to skyrocketing healthcare costs globally, and it's also a primary cause of medical errors and poor quality healthcare. On the quality side, in the UK, they've called unwanted variability in care the postcode lottery. Depending on where you live in the UK, you may have a very different chance of being diagnosed with cancer early, of receiving emergency care, dementia care, or prompt treatment of a stroke. I think that if we told patients that their healthcare was dependent on the lottery, there would be much more urgency to solve this problem. And on the cost side, it's common knowledge that the United States spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world. What may be less commonly understood is that about a quarter of that is estimated to be wasted spend, and a significant percentage of that waste is due to unwanted variability in care. Waste is prevalent in every country. A few examples in Brazil include, in 2017, 100 billion Brazilian reals were wasted due to factors that include medical errors and unnecessary exams. More than 70% of medical errors are preventable in Brazil, according to Fiocruz. And according to IESS, adverse events make up 16 billion reals in cost. Now, we all understand that unwanted variability in care is a problem. and there's no doubt that it's leading to both poor quality and high-cost care. But solving that problem is complex, and you can see that complexity illustrated here. This is an excerpt from an academic research paper and now book written by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman, who also wrote the famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. In this particular work, Dr. Conahp describes the concept of noise, which is pretty much the same thing as that in healthcare we call unwanted variability. The picture with targets highlights what this means. Imagine you have many people shooting arrows at a single target. In the upper left, labeled A, the shooters are all very accurate. In the lower left, labeled C, there's good consistency between the shooters, but all of them are biased in their shots. Maybe they're all using faulty arrows that impact their accuracy. The upper right, labeled B, is the interesting one. Everyone is shooting at the same target, but they're missing in random ways. This is noise. Substitute a medical diagnosis for a target, and you have unwanted variability in care, with everyone seeing the same patient, but making a different decision for a variety of reasons. The main conclusion of Dr. Kahneman's work is that anytime you have human judgment, there's noise, and usually more noise than you think. By the way, this was an excellent book if you want to learn more about noise in healthcare and in other industries. Now, of course, human judgment is a critical component of medical care. The challenge is, how do we reduce the noise from that judgment? How can we bring more consistency to clinical decision-making? One very successful means of improving physician judgment is by providing evidence-based decision support to clinicians while they're making clinical decisions. This is the business that UpToDate has been in for almost 30 years, and we have a lot of experience with it, as UpToDate is now the global leader in clinical decision support, with more than 2 million clinician users and over 1,200 searches for answers to clinical questions per minute. UpToDate has been well studied. I'm showing you just a few of those studies here, including one from Singapore, which found that use of UpToDate changed medical decisions about a third of the time when it was consulted. A study from Japan, which found that use of UpToDate remarkably reduced diagnostic errors. And a study from the United States, which found that use was associated with improvements in multiple quality measures, a shorter length of stay, and reduced mortality. So why are tools like UpToDate so successful? One fundamental reason is that without tools like UpToDate, it is nearly impossible to standardize evidence-based care across large groups of physicians. The medical literature is too vast, and without clinical decision support tools, it isn't accessible at the point of care where physicians really need it. We have a true infodemic in healthcare where the volume of information has outpaced the ability of physicians to absorb it without help. And COVID made the infodemic much worse. Between 2008 and 2018, the number of scientific publications was increasing about 4% per year, a very large number on its own. But that pales in comparison to 2020, when 4% of the world's research was devoted to coronavirus alone. And overall medical journal submissions increased 50 to 90% compared with 2019. If we expect clinicians to make less noisy decisions, we simply have to help them with tools to support those decisions. We've had a unique window into this problem, as UpToDate content on COVID alone was searched almost 30 million times in the last year and a half. Decision support tools, of course, go beyond answering clinical questions with evidence-based content. Another area of increasing study is the use of clinical pathways to help standardize decision-making. Clinical pathways can take problems that are most expensive or leading to the most variability in care and align care teams to make consistent decisions. A growing body of literature suggests that outcomes, cost, and even documentation in the patient record can be improved with adherence to clinical pathways. So what is the future of evidence-based care? One critical part of the future is making better use of the EHRs that we've invested billions of dollars in globally, $36 billion in the US alone. Rather than helping, most EHRs, in fact, make lives more difficult for physicians and other healthcare providers. That speaks to the title of this 2019 article, Death by 1,000 Clicks, Where Electronic Health Records Went Wrong. One of the ways they went wrong is that few EHRs incorporate decision support that we know can help physicians provide better care. But in our experience, even simple integration of decision support into the EHR has resulted in positive attitudes around the EHR, as well as more use of clinical decision support and of the EHR itself. And as more EHRs begin to use standards like Smart on Fire, it will become easier to do more advanced integrations that support clinical pathways and other types of advanced clinical decision support. The next area where we're likely to see significant changes in healthcare is around personalization and contextualization of experiences to enable more targeted patient care. First, what do we mean by personalization and contextualization? We all experience this every time we make a purchase online and the website makes a recommendation for us based on our purchasing behavior. Or we see an online ad based on what we've previously searched. Contextualization helps you better understand a situation. It's raining, therefore you may need an umbrella. Personalization adds more data to that context to gain additional insights. We already know it's raining. Now we see that Mr. Jones looks wet. Therefore, he must need an umbrella. Personalized and contextualized experiences are beginning to have broader appeal in healthcare, and the importance is likely to grow. Now, this could be the topic of an entire presentation, but I'm going to focus on two areas: medication therapy and real-world evidence. First, let's talk about the problem we're trying to solve. In 2017, the World Health Organization launched an initiative called Medication Without Harm, based on some pretty alarming data regarding medication errors. Globally, medication errors cost $42 billion annually, or 1% of global health expenditure. Medication errors cause at least one death per day in the US and injure another 1.3 million people annually. And most of these errors are preventable system failures. Medication errors occur despite the fact that clinical decision support systems that screen for prescribing errors and computerized provider order entry, or CPOE, have been widely available for more than 20 years. One challenge with the way that drug screening has been implemented in most EHRs is alert fatigue, where the effectiveness of screening diminishes substantially as clinicians either ignore alerts or hospitals themselves turn off the alerts. Some studies have found that alerts are overridden by physicians up to 90% of the time, including important alerts that could prevent a serious drug allergy, drug interaction, or dosing error. In addition to alert fatigue, a second challenge is that many hospitals are either doing minimal screening with some manually configured alerts in the EHR, or doing only basic screening with rudimentary content that's infrequently updated and with little ability to manage the alerts. In fact, most hospitals outside the US are currently performing only level 1 or level 2 screening, which does not make use of sophisticated content or algorithms to provide personalized drug screening, and which likely has little impact on clinical outcomes. In contrast, level 3 screening is currently available and has a high sensitivity and specificity of alerting, which not only reduces alert fatigue, but also improves clinician adoption and leads to fewer prescribing errors and reduced cost. A good example of the effectiveness of level 3 screening is a case study from NCKU, a leading public university hospital in Taiwan. They've been using their own homegrown screening solution for level 2 screening of all prescriptions in the hospital for many years. They added level 3 screening with Medispan for just a subset of drugs in the nephrology department that were reviewed by their pharmacists. Despite the limited application of Medispan, the additional screening saved $20,000 over 3 months by preventing adverse events and prolonged hospital stays. And with the tools afforded by the more advanced screening, they were able to reduce unwanted alerts from 20% to 7% over the 3 months of the study. As exciting as these results are, though, the next generation of drug screening is already available in some settings where we can make full use of contextual and personalized screening to provide the best drugs for the individual patient. There are many examples of level 4 screening, but I'll focus on just one for now: pharmacogenomics. Pharmacogenomics is the study of how a person's unique genetic makeup or genome influences his or her response to medications. The potential impact of employing pharmacogenomics in drug prescribing is large. We know that almost everyone carries a genetic variant that could influence their response to medications, and most of us carry more than one variant. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, has already addressed the use of genetics in prescribing for more than 260 drugs. We also know that in the US alone, around 74 million adults and 5 million children receive medications that could be influenced either in dosing or in choice of drug by the patient's genetic biomarkers. And if we just follow the money, pharmacogenomics testing and prescribing is expected to be more than a $10 billion market in the next 4 to 6 years. Why is there so much interest in pharmacogenomics? Simply stated, because personalized medication therapy improves outcomes. Pharmacogenomics testing has been particularly active in psychiatric drugs and oncology, but has applications in multiple settings. I'm giving just a few examples here, with improvements in response to antidepressants in the first two examples, reduction in drug toxicity and adverse events in the second two, and lower risk of hospitalization in the final study. I think it's fair to say that we're only in the early stages of pharmacogenomic testing and precision drug screening, but this is likely to evolve dramatically in everyday practice in the coming years. Another look to the future of personalized medicine is real-world evidence. Real-world data refers to health data that's generated outside of a clinical trial during routine clinical practice. That data may come from a variety of sources. The most common source is electronic health records, but in the US, we also have claims and billing data, and globally, there are disease registries, information on patient-supported sites, personal devices, and a host of other health applications. When we talk about real-world evidence, we're referring to the analysis of that real-world data. I probably could have included the discussion of real-world evidence in the last section around injecting clinical decision support into workflow. But I chose to include it in this section on personalized healthcare, because using real-world evidence has the potential to allow us to mimic patient characteristics more closely than typical clinical trials. One of the challenges of evidence-based medicine is that frequently the patient sitting in front of the doctor doesn't look exactly like the patient studied in randomized controlled trials. So while real-world evidence does not replace the traditional clinical trial, it does hold the promise of providing data that are relevant for very specific patient characteristics that may not otherwise be studied in a standard research setting. Real-world evidence, while relatively new in healthcare, is not new in other industries. If we look to the airline industry as an example, the analog would be use of e-controls or sensors in airplanes, which send real-time data back for analysis. And that data is used to keep planes safe in the air while also informing the next generation of product design. Now, all of this sounds great for airplanes, but can we also use it in medicine? The answer is yes, but we have to use it carefully. And COVID helped highlight why. I already mentioned that the number of publications increased by 50 to 90% during the first year of the pandemic. And given the speed with which we were all seeking information, some of that information was based on real-world data rather than our gold standard randomized controlled trials. That real-world data was critical in some circumstances, but the case of hydroxychloroquine demonstrated why we need to use caution. First, in a study published in France, the investigators used data from more than 1,000 patients treated with the drugs hydroxychloroquine and AZT and observed a very low death rate, only 0.5%. Which led them to conclude that the treatment was effective. But as we learned more during the pandemic, we realized that age is the strongest predictor of mortality from COVID-19. And in the French study, the average patient age was less than 44 years, which was likely the explanation for the lower mortality in the study, not that the drugs were effective. And finally, the prominent journal Lancet was forced to retract a study in which the investigators analyzed real-world EHR data on the adverse effects of hydroxychloroquine from 96,000 patients in 671 hospitals, because critics raised questions about oddities in the data and asked for more details on its origins, which the investigators were not able to provide. Another challenge with real-world data or a learning healthcare system like we see in the airline industry is our global readiness to provide and evaluate this information. The European Medicines Agency published this report in 2018 on the readiness of electronic health record systems in OECD countries to contribute to national health information and research. You can see that we're in various stages of technical and operational readiness on the x-axis and data governance readiness on the y-axis. But there's no doubt that this readiness picture will continue to improve. There are already several initiatives underway globally to improve readiness for examining real-world data, and several examples of where breaking down the wall between the research setting and clinical practice are leading to better understanding of the effectiveness of drugs and care pathways. I'll highlight just a couple. In the second bullet, the Brazil Ministry of Health launched a system called Connect SUS Professional, an electronic medical record system where information from doctors and patients is gathered. There will be data on admissions, digital vaccination cards, patient medications, allergies, among others. With the technology, doctors across the country will have access to clinical history with data recorded in public and private networks at various levels of healthcare. According to the ministry, the program can be accessed in about 15,000 basic health units throughout Brazil. In the last bullet, the European Medicines Agency Code of Conduct facilitates cooperation between the pharmaceutical sector and healthcare systems to support the evaluation of real-world data. And with all this underway, and with appropriate governance, my anticipation is that real-world data will have a material impact on how healthcare is practiced, certainly within the next decade, and potentially even in the next 3 to 5 years. I'm going to consider the last two trends together as there's considerable overlap. The next several years, we're likely to see considerable evolution in artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies in healthcare, while COVID-19 has significantly accelerated virtual care. To illustrate where these trends are likely to come into play, I'm going to move us for a moment away from personalized healthcare to the broader question of how we're going to care for populations over the next decade. Population health becomes particularly important as we think about how to manage the rising costs of healthcare. The biggest challenge we have today in managing populations is chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and the others you see here. Globally, it's estimated that 1 in 3 adults has multiple chronic conditions, and care of these patients consumes anywhere from 70 to 85% of healthcare costs. But the situation is even worse than this, because it's also been estimated that globally, 3 in 4, or 75% of older adults have multiple chronic conditions. And that population of older adults with multiple chronic conditions is growing. In 2017, there were 962 million adults over the age of 60. While over the next 40 years, that number will grow to 2.1 billion. Now, in addition to the expense of caring for this group with a high likelihood of multiple expensive chronic conditions, we also have to ask the question, who will care for these patients? Even if we only take a 10-year view, by 2030, there will be a global demand for 80 million healthcare workers. But the global supply will fall well short of that, with an estimate of only 65 million available healthcare workers. This means that technology is going to be critical to manage and engage these patients at scale. We'll talk about what those technologies may look like in a moment. But before that, we should talk about one more macro trend that's driving technology innovation in healthcare, and that's the rise of virtual care. This is a view of the growth in telehealth visits in the United States stimulated by COVID-19, where there was a peak in April 2020 that's now stabilized. But even at that stabilized rate, we're still at a remarkable 38 times the level of telehealth visits that we saw before the pandemic began. And globally, the telemedicine market is expected to grow at a compounded rate of 26% between 2020 and 2027, reaching $400 billion by 2027. Telemedicine is a component of a broader category of virtual care or digital health that will most certainly grow in the coming years. This model of virtual care was developed by the Advisory Board, which is an analyst firm in the US. They divided into synchronous care, which includes traditional telemedicine as we typically think about it, and asynchronous care, which is a form of virtual care delivery in which patients and providers exchange information in a series of one-way interactions. Patients send their symptoms, medical history, and/or biometric information to an application or directly to a provider. The provider, or an artificial intelligence application, then reviews these details and weighs potential care decisions. I'm excited about asynchronous virtual care for a few reasons. First, it makes use of technologies that can extend the reach of healthcare providers and potentially relieve some of the burden of staffing shortages. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Second, it has the potential to dramatically change traditional models of care that currently depend on seeing patients on an episodic basis to a more contemporary model that recognizes that we can have a better picture of our patient's health if we move beyond the hospital or clinic setting. Finally, virtual care has proven to be popular for patients and has the potential to have them more fully engaged in their healthcare. I'm not the only one excited about virtual care or digital health. Investment overall is accelerating, with venture capital investment in the first half of 2021 exceeding all of 2020 in the United States, with the primary investment in telemedicine, but also in a variety of other digital technologies and data. Investment is, of course, not limited to the United States. The telehealth market in the UAE, for example, is forecast to reach over $530 million by 2025, with investments in the virtual visit market, mobile or mHealth apps and wearables, and virtual clinics and hospitals. The good news is we're beginning to see outcomes data on digital medicine programs. Ochsner Health is one of the leading healthcare systems in the southern United States, caring for a diverse patient population. They developed a digital medicine program for chronic conditions. Here I'm showing you data from the diabetes and hypertension programs that combines digital tools that patients use in their home with dedicated teams of pharmacists and other non-physician healthcare providers who monitor these patients and follow strict care pathways to adjust treatment regimens. This program is interesting for a number of reasons. First, it's using technology to monitor patients at home rather than relying on episodic blood pressure or blood sugar measurements in the clinician's office. Second, it's making use of non-physician healthcare providers to address the provider shortage we spoke about earlier. But most interesting is what I'm showing you here, which is that the program is very effective. 79% of patients enrolled in the digital medicine program achieved blood pressure goals in 6 months versus only 26% receiving usual care. Similarly, 81% of patients enrolled in digital medicine for diabetes achieved their blood sugar goals at 6 months versus 62% receiving usual care. And despite the fact that patients were supplied with digital equipment at home for free, the program saved money. Europe is anticipated to be the second largest region in telemedicine market share due to changing government guidelines for the use of digital health and the rising prevalence of chronic diseases. One challenge the UK was looking to solve was the large number of dermatology visits that were taking a long time to schedule because they were overwhelming the number of dermatologists available, while at the same time delaying the diagnosis of skin cancer. What I'm showing here is a program called Telederm, which allows GPs or nurses from the National Health Service to submit a history and a dermoscopic image using the device you see in the picture. This enables physicians to provide an accurate assessment of a skin lesion while saving time and a costly dermatologist appointment. Most assessments are delivered within 24 hours, which helps reduce patient stress when compared to having to wait for an outpatient appointment. And in cases diagnosed as benign, the patient can be reassured and a referral to a specialist can be avoided. The program has been very effective and well liked and accepted by both patients and clinicians. As we're developing new workflows to support virtual care, the other area of excitement is the ability to inject clinical decision support for clinicians plus education for patients right within the virtual care workflow. This is something we're partnering with alongside a major telehealth provider, Doximity, to help redefine what the optimal virtual care workflow will look like. Healthcare didn't get workflow right when we first implemented electronic health records, but we have a second chance with virtual care. And as healthcare organizations, we owe it to both clinicians and patients to get it right this time. I'll now close the presentation where we started. Given the acceleration of the acceptance of virtual care due to COVID, the overall investment in at-home digital monitoring and other types of remote care, the use of data to provide more personalized experiences, and the evolution of decision support and workflow, we're likely to see dramatic shifts in the way care is delivered, particularly for chronic conditions, over the next 3 to 5 years. In my opinion, these changes will be more substantial than any we've seen in the modern era of healthcare. It's a great time to be in healthcare, and it's a fantastic opportunity for leaders of organizations to be at the forefront of change. Vision and leadership will be needed to improve the quality of care, reduce the cost of care, and ensure that healthcare is the high reliability industry that our patients deserve. Thank you again for having me. I know we aren't taking any questions, but here's my contact information if you want to follow up with me on any of these topics.